When hikers discovered an old man crawling from a World War II bunker in 1994, he told them he was dead and to leave him alone. 50 years earlier, Corporal Otto Brenner had lain down among corpses in a battle crater, and he never got up. The hikers found him on a Tuesday morning in October of 1994, emerging from what looked like an animal burrow dug into the side of an old concrete bunker. The Hurtgen Forest was full of war remnants, rusted metal and crumbling fortifications that nobody bothered removing, so the bunker itself was unremarkable. What stopped the hikers cold was the man crawling out of it, elderly and filthy, his beard reaching halfway down his chest, wearing layers of ragged clothing that might have been salvaged from a dozen different sources. He saw them and froze completely, his body going rigid in a way that seemed unnatural, practiced. The hikers, a young couple from Dusseldorf, called out in German, asking if he needed help. The old man stared at them with pale eyes that seemed to look through rather than at them. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse from disuse, the accent old-fashioned in a way the hikers could not quite place. He told them he was dead, and they should leave him alone. The police arrived 3 hours later, climbing the forest trail with the hikers serving as nervous guides. By then, the old man had retreated into his bunker, but the officers coaxed him out with patience and bread from someone's lunch. He emerged slowly, moving with the caution of a wild animal approaching a trap. The police estimated his age at 70 or older, though malnutrition and exposure made precise assessment difficult. He refused to give his name, or explain what he was doing living in a World War II bunker, half a century after the war ended. Inside the bunker, investigators found evidence of long-term habitation. Sleeping area, constructed from stolen camping equipment and military blankets so old they disintegrated at touch. Food stores accumulated from petty theft, canned goods and dried foods organized with military precision. Most startling were the journals, dozens of notebooks filled with dense handwriting in Old German script, documenting daily routines, observations of hikers and forest changes, and increasingly disturbed reflections on survival and death. The man was taken to a hospital in Aachen for evaluation. He submitted to the transport with strange passivity, neither resisting nor cooperating, simply allowing events to happen to him as if he had no agency in his own life. Medical examination revealed severe malnutrition, untreated injuries that had healed badly, and the physical degradation of someone who had lived outdoors in harsh conditions for years, possibly decades. The mystery deepened when fingerprints were taken. The German police still maintained records from the war years, painstakingly preserved through reunification. The prints matched a file marked deceased, a Wehrmacht corporal named Otto Brenner, officially killed in action in the Hurtgen Forest in November of 1944. According to every official record, the man sitting in the hospital psychiatric ward had been dead for 50 years. Otto Brenner was born in 1921 in a village outside Munich, the eldest son of a postal worker and a seamstress. His childhood was ordinary in the way of children born between wars, marked by economic hardship and the slow recovery of a defeated nation. He was studious, good with numbers, and his teachers suggested he might attend university to study engineering. Those plans dissolved when he turned 18 in 1939, and Germany invaded Poland. He was conscripted in 1940, assigned to an infantry unit, and spent the next 4 years being transferred across the expanding Reich. He served in France after the conquest, garrison duty that was mostly boring. He was in Russia during the winter of 1941, where he saw things that he could not describe in letters home, and learned that war was nothing like the propaganda films suggested. Frostbite took 3 of his toes, earning him a medical transfer away from the Eastern Front. By October of 1944, Otto had survived longer than most men in his original unit. He had learned to keep his head down, to follow orders without thinking too deeply about their meaning, to make himself useful enough to avoid punishment but not so competent that he was given dangerous assignments. He wrote weekly letters to his mother and younger sister Greta, carefully cheerful narratives that omitted the fear and exhaustion that defined his daily existence. His unit was transferred to the Westwall defenses in late September, assigned to hold positions in the Hurtgen Forest against the advancing American forces. The forest was dense and dark, thousands of hectares of fir trees that blocked sunlight and turned every path into a potential ambush site. The German commanders spoke confidently about holding the line, about making the Americans pay for every meter of ground. The soldiers who had been there longer knew better, had seen what American artillery could do to men hiding in forests. Otto's letters from October grew shorter, vaguer. He told his mother about the trees, about how quiet the forest could be between shellings, about a stray dog that followed his squad for 3 days before disappearing. He did not mention the teenage boys being sent to the front now, children in oversized uniforms who cried at night. He did not describe the bodies hanging from trees, deserters executed as examples. He did not explain that everyone knew the war was lost, but no one could say it aloud without risking a bullet. His last letter home was dated November 10, 1944. He wrote about the changing leaves, about hoping the winter would not be as cold as Russia. He told Greta to study hard and help their mother with the sewing. He signed it with his usual closing, promising to write again soon. The letter arrived in Bavaria 3 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that the official telegram came. Corporal Otto Brenner, killed in action November 16, buried where he fell, died serving the fatherland. His mother kept that last letter in a Bible for the rest of her life. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest began in September of 1944, and consumed men like a furnace consuming fuel. The Americans wanted to break through to the Rhine. The Germans needed to hold the West Wall, and between these strategic objectives lay 90 square kilometers of dense forest that became an abattoir. Otto's unit occupied a section of the line southeast of the village of Wassenach, dug into positions that offered minimal protection from the American artillery that pounded them day and night. The forest itself became an enemy. Trees shattered by shells sent splinters flying like shrapnel, wood fragments that could kill as easily as metal. The canopy blocked aerial observation but also trapped shell bursts, amplifying their effect. Men died from concussion without visible wounds, killed by pressure waves channeled through the trees. The ground was a mixture of mud and decaying vegetation that swallowed equipment and made every movement exhausting. Otto's squad shrank steadily through November. Heinrich was killed by a sniper on the 3rd. Gustav and Werner died when their bunker took a direct hit on the 7th. Young Peter, only 16 years old, stepped on a mine on the 9th, and bled out screaming for his mother while Otto held pressure on wounds that could not be stopped. By mid-November, Otto's original squad of 12 had been reduced to 4. The gaps filled with replacements who rarely lasted more than days. The officers grew more desperate and more brutal. Captain Vogel shot a private for falling asleep on watch, left the body as a warning. Another man was hanged from a tree for throwing away his rifle during a barrage, the noose made from communication wire. The executions were meant to stiffen resolve, but they only deepened the understanding that death waited everywhere, from the enemy, from their own commanders, from pure chance and bad luck. Otto stopped writing letters home. There was nothing left to say that would not reveal the truth, and the truth would break his mother's heart. Instead, he focused on small acts of survival, keeping his rifle clean despite the mud, finding dry places to sleep, sharing cigarettes with the other survivors, not thinking too far ahead, not planning beyond the next hour. He discovered that if he let his mind go blank, if he reduced existence to pure mechanical response, the fear became manageable. On November 15th, an American patrol infiltrated their position during darkness. Otto killed a man for the first time, shooting at a shape moving between trees, hearing the cry that confirmed he had hit flesh rather than shadow. The Americans withdrew, leaving their wounded behind. Otto listened to one man call for help in English for 3 hours before the voice finally stopped. He felt nothing about this, not pride or guilt or satisfaction, just a dull recognition that he had crossed some threshold and could not return. The next morning the barrage began that would consume everything he had been and replace it with something that could only survive by pretending to be dead. The artillery opened up at dawn on November 16th. American guns positioned in the hills above the forest, firing in coordinated volleys that walked across the German positions like the footsteps of giants. Otto was in a foxhole reinforced with logs when the first shells landed, close enough to shower him with dirt but not close enough to kill. He pressed himself against the earth and tried to make his body smaller, an impossible goal when the world itself was exploding. The barrage lasted 2 hours, though Otto lost all sense of time in the chaos. Between explosions he heard screaming, men calling for medics who could not move through the fire, officers shouting orders that made no sense. A direct hit on the bunker 20 meters away sent a geyser of earth and wood and unidentifiable pieces into the air. Otto closed his eyes and recited numbers, multiplication tables from school, anything to keep his mind from fracturing completely. When the shelling finally lifted, American infantry came through the smoke and dust, moving carefully between the shattered trees. Otto heard the rattle of small arms fire, grenades exploding, the sounds of close combat filtering through the ringing in his ears. He grabbed his rifle and started to climb out of his foxhole, following training and instinct even as his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the weapon. The shell that changed everything landed 15 meters away, the blast wave lifting Otto and throwing him sideways into a crater that had been gouged by earlier impacts. He landed among bodies, German and American both, men killed in previous fighting, and left where they fell because retrieving the dead was impossible under constant fire. Otto hit the muddy crater bottom hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, his rifle flying from his grasp. He lay there gasping, unable to move, staring up at the gray sky visible through the broken canopy. More shells began landing, the Americans adjusting fire to hit targets further back. Otto heard his own unit pulling back, someone shouting about retreat and regrouping. He tried to call out, to signal that he was alive and needed help, but his voice would not work and his body refused to respond to commands. A boot stepped on his leg as someone ran past the crater. Otto barely felt it. He was lying partially under a dead German soldier, his face inches from the corpse's blank eyes. Other bodies surrounded him, a tangle of gray uniforms and olive drab, all of them still and silent. The thought came to him slowly, filtering through the shock and pain. What if he simply stayed here? What if he did nothing, said nothing, just lay among the dead until everyone left? The idea should have horrified him. Instead, it felt like relief, like permission to stop fighting and pretending and trying to survive. He could be dead, officially and permanently, and the war would go on without him. Otto closed his eyes and made himself still. The first night was the hardest. Otto lay motionless in the crater as darkness fell, listening to sounds that defined a battlefield in chaos. Wounded men crying for help, German and American patrols moving cautiously through the forest, artillery firing sporadically in the distance. His body screamed for movement, muscles cramping from holding the same position for hours, but he forced himself to remain absolutely still. Playing dead required perfecting the art of appearing lifeless, even when everything in him wanted to move. By dawn, frost had settled on the bodies around him. Otto was so cold he could barely feel his extremities, but the cold was useful, made the stillness easier to maintain. American soldiers passed close to the crater several times that morning, checking bodies for intelligence or valuables. When a boot prodded his side, Otto controlled his breathing, made himself slack and heavy. The soldier grunted and moved on. Being tested and passing the test gave Otto a strange confidence. He could do this, he could be dead. The second day, thirst became unbearable. After dark, when the forest grew quiet, Otto finally moved. His joints screamed protest as he crawled out of the crater, moving with excruciating slowness. He found a shell hole with muddy water pooled at the bottom, drank despite knowing it was probably contaminated, and searched nearby bodies for food. A German corporal had half a loaf of hard bread in his pack. An American private carried chocolate bars. Otto took what he needed, returned to his crater before dawn, and resumed his position among the dead. The pattern established itself over the following days. Dawn to dusk, Otto was a corpse, unmoving even when patrols passed within meters. Dusk to dawn, he became a ghost, scavenging supplies from the dead and abandoned positions, drinking from shell holes and streams, staying low and invisible. The forest was full of hiding places, destroyed bunkers and thick undergrowth, where a man could vanish if he moved carefully enough. Within a week, both German and American forces had moved the battle elsewhere. The Hurtgen Forest remained contested territory, but this particular sector was emptied of living soldiers, just corpses slowly being reclaimed by mud and weather. Otto found an abandoned German bunker half-collapsed but still offering shelter. He dragged supplies there, established a hiding place, and continued his nocturnal existence. By the end of November, Otto had become something neither fully alive nor completely dead. During daylight, if anyone approached, he would lie down among bodies or in his bunker, making himself corpse-like with practiced ease. At night, he foraged like an animal, taking what he needed to survive another day. He stopped thinking about returning to his unit, stopped imagining surrender to the Americans, stopped planning anything beyond the next meal and the next hiding place. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest continued through December, thousands more men dying in the frozen mud. Otto survived in the spaces between, invisible and silent, a ghost who had learned that death was safer than life. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Otto learned about it 3 days later from a group of American soldiers passing through the forest, celebrating with cigarettes and laughter that echoed between the trees. He watched from inside a thicket of dense brush, close enough to hear them discussing going home, about ships that would take them back across the Atlantic, about the war finally being over. They moved on after an hour, and Otto remained in his hiding place, trying to process what surrender meant for him. The logical decision was to emerge, surrender to Allied forces, and begin whatever process existed for repatriating prisoners of war. Thousands of German soldiers were doing exactly that, walking out of the forest with white flags and hands raised, accepting captivity as preferable to continued hiding. Otto had constructed elaborate fantasies about this moment during the long winter, imagining the relief of giving up, of becoming someone else's responsibility, instead of managing his own survival day after desperate day. But when the moment came, he could not move. 6 months of playing dead had calcified into something deeper than strategy. His name was on casualty lists, his family had been notified of his death, his existence had been officially terminated in November of 1944. Returning would mean explaining where he had been, why he had not rejoined his unit or surrendered sooner. It would mean admitting he had survived while his squad died, that he had chosen to hide rather than fight. The shame of that admission paralyzed him more effectively than any physical restraint. How could he face his mother knowing that he had played dead in a crater while Peter bled out calling for help? How could he return to his village where every family had lost sons and fathers, claiming he had survived through cowardice and desertion? The war had taken everything from Germany, but at least the dead had honor. He had nothing except the fact of survival, which felt less like victory than like theft. Days passed, then weeks. Allied patrols continued moving through the forest, now searching for holdouts and stragglers rather than fighting. Otto hid from all of them, retreating deeper into the bunker complex, venturing out only when certain of solitude. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment to emerge, but the right moment never came, and eventually he stopped looking for it. By summer of 1945, the forest had emptied of soldiers completely. Civilians began returning to nearby villages, starting the long process of rebuilding. Otto watched them from a distance, studied their routines, and began occasional nighttime raids for food and supplies. He discovered that being dead was easier than being alive, required less explanation, and carried less weight. The Otto Brenner, who had been a son and brother and soldier, no longer existed. What remained was something simpler, a creature that ate and hid and survived without purpose or plan. The war had ended, but Otto's hiding had just begun, and with each passing day the possibility of stopping receded further into impossibility. The first decade was about establishing routines. Otto mapped the forest systematically, learning every bunker and trail, identifying which areas attracted hikers, and which remained undisturbed. He perfected the timing of his scavenging, understanding when villages below were asleep, when supply sheds were left unguarded, when he could move through the world without being seen. The skills that had kept him alive during the war adapted to peacetime survival, becoming more refined and elaborate with each passing year. He occupied a series of bunkers, moving between them seasonally to avoid detection. The main shelter was deep in the forest's eastern section, reinforced concrete that had survived the war intact. He dug out a living space behind a false wall, created ventilation that drew no attention, and stored supplies with the same precision he had once used maintaining military equipment. The space was cramped and dark, but it was his, controlled and safe. Food came from multiple sources. Gardens on the forest edge could be raided at night, a handful of vegetables taken from plots too large for owners to track every plant. Hiking groups left food behind at campsites, careless or generous depending on perspective. The villages below threw away food that was still edible, and Otto learned the schedules of trash collection, timing his visits to coincide with maximum availability and minimum risk. He never took enough to cause alarm, never established patterns that might be noticed. The forest became his world, the only reality that mattered. He learned which mushrooms were safe, which plants could supplement his diet, where springs provided clean water. He understood animal behavior, used their trails and burrows, became part of the forest's ecosystem rather than an intruder in it. Hikers occasionally reported glimpses of a wild man in the trees, but these reports were dismissed as imagination or exaggeration. No one seriously believed someone could live undetected in the Herdgen forest for years. Otto avoided all human contact with obsessive care. When hikers approached, he either hid or employed his practiced stillness, becoming a feature of the landscape rather than a living presence. Once, a couple nearly stumbled into his bunker entrance, but he lay motionless in shadow until they passed. The woman commented on an odd smell, the man dismissed it as animal deen, and they moved on. Otto waited 2 hours before breathing normally again. The isolation should have driven him mad, but Otto discovered that madness was relative. He talked to himself constantly, narrating his actions and decisions, maintaining human speech even with no one to hear it. He kept journals, documenting daily routines and observations in notebooks stolen from village shops. The writing kept his mind organized, gave structure to existence that otherwise threatened to dissolve into pure survival instinct. By 1955, Otto had been hiding for over a decade. The bunker held accumulated supplies that would sustain him for months. His routines were so established they required almost no conscious thought. He had become a ghost haunting the forest, neither alive nor dead but something in between, and he had stopped, remembering why he had chosen this fate. The 1960s brought changes that Otto observed from his forest refuge with confused fascination. Hikers appeared in different clothes, colorful and casual rather than the practical gear of previous decades. They carried transistor radios that played music unlike anything from Otto's youth, strange rhythms and electric sounds that filtered through the trees. Young people came in groups, laughing and arguing about politics and philosophy in ways that would have been dangerous during the Reich. The world had moved on and left him behind. The forest itself became popular for recreation. What had been a haunted battleground slowly transformed into a hiking destination, trails cleared and marked, historical plaques installed, explaining the battle's significance. Otto watched workers restore one of the bunkers near the main trail, turning it into a memorial site complete with photographs and information panels. He studied the photos when the workers left, seeing images of the forest during the war, bodies and destroyed equipment and mud. His own face might have been among the soldiers depicted, though he could not tell after so many years. West Germany was experiencing what newspapers called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that rebuilt the nation from ruins into prosperity. Otto stole newspapers occasionally, reading by candlelight in his bunker, trying to understand the country being described. New highways and factories, full employment and rising wages, integration into European cooperation and Atlantic alliance. The Germany being created bore no resemblance to the one he had fled by playing dead in a crater. He wondered sometimes about his family. His mother would be elderly now if still alive, his sister Greta approaching middle age. Had they mourned him after the telegram arrived? Had they moved on, or did they still remember the son and brother who died in the forest? The questions had no answers, and pursuing answers would require emerging from hiding, which remained impossible. He was dead, officially and permanently, and dead men could not return to claim their lives. The isolation deepened in ways Otto only partially recognized. Conversations with himself grew longer, more elaborate, sometimes involving arguments between different aspects of his personality. He assigned names to these voices, gave them distinct opinions and characteristics, and conducted debates about trivial decisions as if consulting advisors. The journals reflected this fragmentation, entries switching between off to the seven, different narrative perspectives, first person becoming third person becoming some hybrid that was neither. By 1970, Otto was 50 years old, though he had lost track of his exact birthday. His beard was fully gray, his body worn down by decades of inadequate nutrition and harsh living conditions. He looked ancient, a figure from fairy tales rather than history. Children who glimpsed him at the forest edge ran home with stories of trolls or wild men, stories their parents dismissed, while secretly wondering if something might actually live in those dark woods. The world continued changing, but Otto remained fixed in 1944, a man who had stopped time by refusing to acknowledge its passage. The forest was his prison and sanctuary, the only place where being dead was more sustainable than being alive. The 1980s brought arthritis that made Otto's hands curl into claws, joint pain that turned every movement into negotiation with his failing body. He was past 60 now, an age that seemed impossible for someone living in a forest bunker without medical care or adequate food. His teeth had mostly fallen out, gums infected and painful. His vision blurred at distances, making his scavenging missions more dangerous, as he could no longer clearly identify approaching threats. The journals from this period revealed a mind fragmenting under the weight of decades spent alone. Entries became less about daily survival and more about elaborate justifications for continued hiding. Otto wrote long philosophical treatises on the nature of death, arguing that he had achieved a form of existence superior to normal life. He detailed conversations with the dead soldiers from the crater, men whose names he had never known but who had become his constant companions in the darkness of the bunker. He sometimes forgot why he was hiding. Entries from 1983 showed confusion about whether the war was still ongoing, whether he was still evading capture, whether his mother was still alive and waiting for letters. The next page would snap back to clear reality, acknowledging that decades had passed and his reasons for hiding had long since lost relevance. But by then, the hiding itself had become the reason, the only purpose structuring his existence. The fear of discovery intensified as his mental state deteriorated. Otto began constructing elaborate warning systems around his bunker, tripwires connected to cans that would alert him to approaching hikers. He practiced his playing dead routine obsessively, lying motionless for hours at a time, testing how long he could suppress breathing and heartbeat. The skill that had once been survival strategy had become compulsion, something he did even when alone, as if his body needed constant proof that it could still convincingly imitate death. Winters became especially difficult. The cold that he had once tolerated now penetrated to his bones, left him shaking and disoriented for days at a time. He burned scavenged wood for heat, but smoke risked detection, so he endured the cold more often than not, wrapped in layers of stolen clothing and military blankets that were more whole than fabric. Frostbite took 2 more toes and parts of both ears. Slow necrosis that he could do nothing about except wait for the dead tissue to fall away. The loneliness was total and absolute. Otto had not spoken to another human being since April of 1945, nearly 50 years of silence broken only by his own voice. He could no longer remember what conversation felt like, what it meant to have someone respond to his words with understanding and reaction. The isolation had become so complete that other people seemed like memories from another life, characters from stories rather than real beings he had once known. By 1990, Otto Brenner was 70 years old, had been hiding for 46 years, and had forgotten how to stop. The bunker was all he knew, the routine was all he understood, and the thought of emerging into a world that had moved on without him was more terrifying than any hardship the forest could inflict. The hospital psychiatric ward confused Otto more than anything since the war. Clean white walls and fluorescent lighting, the smell of disinfectant and floor polish, sounds of machinery and distant voices speaking in German that sounded wrong, too modern and casual. He sat in a bed wearing a hospital gown, the first new clothing he had worn in decades, and stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Nurses spoke to him gently, doctors asked questions he could barely process, and everyone wanted him to do things that made no sense. The fingerprint match to Otto Brenner's military records created bureaucratic chaos. How did one process a man who was legally dead, whose death benefits had been paid out 50 years earlier, whose records had been archived and forgotten? The German government had procedures for many things but not for soldiers who played dead for half a century and then suddenly reappeared. Lawyers consulted with historians, who consulted with military records offices, everyone trying to determine what legal status Otto actually held. His sister Greta was located in Bavaria, living in the same village where they had grown up. She was 72 years old, widowed, with grandchildren who had never heard of the uncle who died before they were born. When contacted by phone, she hung up 3 times, insisting it was a cruel prank. Her brother had died in the war, she had mourned him for 50 years, and she would not entertain fantasies about impossible resurrections. Otto's psychiatrist, Dr. Hoffman, spent hours trying to understand the mechanism that had sustained such prolonged isolation. What Otto described was not simple desertion or cowardice, but something more complex. A psychological state where continued hiding became easier than the catastrophic effort of returning. The initial decision to play dead had been survival instinct, but each day that passed made returning harder, until the weight of time itself became the prison. Otto had not hidden for 50 years, he had hidden for one day, repeated 18,000 times. The attempt at reunion with Greta happened in November, carefully orchestrated by social workers who hoped family connection might help Otto's reintegration. She came to the hospital reluctantly, an elderly woman wearing her best dress and carrying a handbag she clutched like a shield. Otto sat in a dayroom chair, his beard trimmed by hospital staff, but his eyes still holding that distant stare that never quite focused on the present. They looked at each other for a long moment, 2 people who had been siblings a lifetime ago. Greta saw an ancient wild man with her brother's bone structure buried under decades of deprivation. Otto saw a stranger whose face held vague echoes of the teenage girl who had waved goodbye in 1940. Neither knew what to say. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled with all the years that could not be recovered or explained. Greta stayed 15 minutes, making small talk that landed awkwardly in the space between them. She did not ask where he had been or why he had never come home. He did not apologize for letting her believe he was dead. When she left, they both understood they would not meet again. Some absences were too long to bridge, some deaths too permanent to reverse even when the body still breathed. Dr. Hoffman's treatment plan focused on gradual reintegration, small steps toward rejoining a society that Otto had not participated in since 1944. Simple things first: sleeping indoors without panic, eating in a dining room with other people, tolerating electric lights and modern sounds. Otto tried, genuinely attempted to follow the program, but his body rebelled against every element of normal life. Enclosed spaces triggered claustrophobia that left him gasping and sweating. Other people's presence caused anxiety so severe he would freeze, literally playing dead in the middle of the hospital corridor until staff coaxed him back to movement. The program moved him to a halfway house in February of 1995, a facility designed for people transitioning from institutions to independent living. Otto lasted 6 days. The other residents, recovering addicts and mental health patients, tried to be friendly, but their casual conversation overwhelmed him. Someone asked where he was from, and he could not answer, the question requiring context and explanation he could not formulate. That night, he climbed out a window and was found the next morning sleeping in bushes behind the building. They tried a private apartment next, small studio with supervision from social workers who checked on him daily. The space was meant to be his, a place where he could establish routines without institutional structure. Otto hated it immediately. The walls felt like they were closing in, the ceiling too low, the windows showing streetscapes he could not comprehend. Cars passed making sounds he did not recognize. Pedestrians spoke into mobile phones. Televisions played programs that might as well have been from another planet. He lasted 3 weeks before the social worker found him living on the apartment's tiny balcony, refusing to go inside. Employment was impossible. The government provided disability benefits, acknowledging that a man who had lived in a forest for 50 years could not reasonably be expected to hold a job. But they encouraged participation in workshops or volunteer programs, anything to provide structure and social connection. Otto attended a woodworking class twice, sat silent and motionless while an instructor explained power tools and safety procedures. The third session, another participant tried to shake his hand, and Otto ran from the building, found a park, and hid in dense shrubs until someone called police to remove the vagrant. The fundamental problem became clear through months of failed attempts. Otto had not simply hidden from society for 50 years, he had become something that could not exist within society. His survival had depended on avoiding human contact, on perfecting stillness and invisibility, on reducing himself to pure survival instinct. These adaptations could not be reversed through therapy or goodwill. He was like an animal raised in captivity then released to the wild, except reversed, he was a wild creature being forced into captivity called civilization. Dr. Internis, Hoffman's final report was honest and devastating. Otto Brenner could not be reintegrated into normal life, the damage was too deep and comprehensive. He required supervision to ensure basic needs were met, but forcing him into conventional housing or programs caused more harm than good. The recommendation was for specialized care, but what that meant remained unclear. There was no facility designed for soldiers who had played dead for half a century. The decision came in August of 1996. Otto had been cycling through programs and facilities for nearly 2 years, each attempt ending in failure and retreat. He sat in Dr. Hoffman's office during what would be their final session, and for the first time in months, spoke more than single-word responses. He needed to return to the forest, he explained carefully. Not permanently, perhaps, but he could not continue this way, trapped in spaces that made his skin crawl and his heart race. The forest was the only place he felt safe, the only environment his damaged psychology could tolerate. The authorities debated the ethics of this. Could they legally allow a mentally impaired elderly man to live alone in the woods? But Otto was not technically under commitment, could not be held against his will without demonstrating danger to himself or others. Playing dead was not violence. Isolation was not crime. After consultation with paperation, lawyers and psychiatrists, they reached a compromise. Otto could return to the Hürtgen forest, but social workers would check on him weekly, bringing supplies and monitoring his health. He would have an emergency beacon to summon help if needed. It was not abandonment, they insisted, but rather accommodation of his unique needs. Otto returned to his bunker in September. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, like a prisoner released from torture. The darkness and confinement that had terrified others felt like home, the only space where his presence made sense. He resumed old routines, scavenging and hiding and talking to himself in the darkness. The social workers visited as promised, leaving food and medicine, checking vital signs before departing. They wrote in their reports that Otto seemed happier in the forest than he ever had in any facility they provided. Greta visited once more, in April of 1997, hiking up the trail with her grandson supporting her elbow. She brought photographs, old family pictures she thought Otto might want. They sat outside the bunker in spring sunshine, while she pointed to faces and told stories about people who had died decades earlier. Otto looked at the photographs politely, but showed no recognition, no emotional response to images of parents and relatives and his own younger face. The past she was describing belonged to someone else, a different Otto Brenner who had ceased to exist in November of 1944. The social worker found him in March of 1998, lying in his bunker in the position he had perfected over 54 years. This time, the stillness was permanent, the playing finally authentic. Medical examination suggested he had died 3 or 4 days earlier, heart failure likely, though malnutrition and exposure contributed. He was 76 years old, had been officially dead since he was 23, and had spent the intervening half-century in a liminal state between half-century, life and death, that had no proper name. They buried him in a military cemetery with full honors, a gesture that seemed ironic given that his survival had depended on rejecting everything military service represented. The headstone listed both dates, 1921 to 1998, with a single line that attempted to summarize an unsummarizable life. Otto Brenner, soldier and survivor. Greta attended the funeral with her family, standing at the grave of a brother she had mourned twice, once in 1944 and again now, understanding finally that both times were real and neither was complete. The bunker was sealed by Forest Services, marked as a historical site related to the battle. Hikers, occasionally asked about the old man who had lived there, were told brief versions of his story and moved on to other trails. Otto Brenner became a footnote in histories of the Hurtgen Forest, the soldier who vanished and then reappeared 50 years later, a curiosity that raised uncomfortable questions about survival and sanity and the impossibility of returning from some kinds of death. He had played dead so successfully that even resurrection could not make him truly alive again, had hidden so completely that being found only revealed how lost he actually was. In the end, he got what he had sought in that crater in 1944, a death that would not be questioned or explained, permanent and final, and his alone.